thank you for staying with our journey all the way to the last. And just to recapitulate, we discovered that the early Christians responded differently to the great pandemics of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. They did not abandon the sick, but they nursed them, even at the cost of their own lives. And we posited that what the early Christians believed, what they believed about God, about sickness, and about health, made all the difference in their response. And then we traced this belief back to Jesus himself, that extraordinary young carpenter who one day walked away from the carpenter's bench. Jesus himself evidently believed that the healing of disease and the liberation from evil spirits, he believed that to be the kingdom of God in action. By devoting himself to healing and exorcism, Jesus pushed back against the intolerable constraints upon a full humanity that God intended in creation. Now, as we were reading the stories of Jesus' healings over these past weeks, I noticed something that I had not seen before, something that I had not taken full account of, namely, that Jesus had difficulty accepting death. I noticed it first in the story of the 12-year-old girl, the daughter of the synagogue ruler Jairus, in Mark chapter 5. And that is where I propose to start our final investigation. In other words, today we're going to talk about the early Christian response to death. The story of Jairus' daughter in Mark chapter 5 is conflated, as you know, with the healing of the woman with a hemorrhage. Jesus is on his way to the house of Jairus, and he is interrupted by this woman. In the pre-Markan miracle collection, these two stories were probably independent. But in combining the stories, I think that Mark pursues a true insight. Both stories are about women. Both are about life and reproduction. The woman has suffered a flow of blood for 12 years. The girl is 12 years old. In other words, at the onset of puberty, and thus at an age where she can give life to others. So let's look at this story. Mark chapter 5, verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed over the sea in the boat back to the other shore, a large crowd was gathered to him, and he was beside the sea. And a certain synagogue leader came to him, whose name was Jairus. And when he saw him, he fell at Jesus' feet. Now, notice how the synagogue president forgets all about the social distance between himself and the poor carpenter turned rabbi from Galilee. Why does he forget all about it? Obviously, because of his distress over his 12-year-old daughter's illness. Now look at the next verse. And he appealed to him earnestly, saying, my daughter is at the point of death. The Greek there is eskatos eche, which should be translated literally, she has the last. She is at the last point. It's interesting that Luke's version of this story adds that the 12-year-old girl was Jairus' only daughter, intensifying the tragedy of the loss. And so Mark continues with Jairus speaking, come and lay your hands upon her. Evidently, the synagogue president knows that Jesus heals, as we have learned, by contact. Lay your hands on her in order that she may be rescued and live. And he went away with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing upon him. Then, after the interruption by the woman with the hemorrhage, Jesus is about to resume his path toward the house of Jairus. And look at the next verse, chapter 5, verse 35. And while he was still speaking, that is, to the woman, some people from the household of the synagogue president came saying, your daughter has died. Epiphanin. Why do you trouble the teacher? Now, the little expression that is used here, the verb is skulo. And if we were all together in our classroom at Epiphany, I would ask you to say it with me, skulo. It means to bother, to annoy, to trouble. And there is a little Greek idiom that I think is relevant here. Me skulu. Don't trouble yourself. Don't trouble yourself. Don't bother. And these two words give expression to the finality of death. In other words, there is nothing more for Jesus to do. Look at the next verse, chapter 5, verse 36. It is usually translated, but Jesus overheard the message as it was spoken and said to the synagogue ruler, do not fear, only trust. Now, again, I'm going to take exception to the decision of the Revised Version Translation Committee. The verb parakuo, which is translated overhear. So Jesus overheard the message. In fact, the verb is much richer and more suggestive. Listen to this. It can mean to pay no attention to something that has been heard, or to ignore, to refuse to listen. And a number of commentators argue that this is the correct translation, not just Larry Welborn. And let me draw the lesson here. In other words, Jesus hears the message from the people of Jairus' household, informing the synagogue ruler that his daughter has died. And according to Mark, Jesus refused to listen. He paid it no attention. He ignored it. One final thing about this verse, the verb pistuo, which is translated believe, happens to be in the present tense. And Pastor Charlie, if you go back to your Greek classroom at seminary, you'll remember that the present tense in Greek denotes continuous, ongoing action. In other words, what Jesus calls for in the face of the finality of the little girl's life, he calls for faithful perseverance in the face of death. Next verse, 537. And he did not allow anyone to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they went into the house of the synagogue president, and he saw a tumult. The Greek word for tumult is thorubos. I don't know if you want to say that with me. It's such a powerful word, thorubos. And it literally means a raising of voices, noise, clamor, confusion, turmoil, uproar. And the word is used especially, it is especially frequent to describe the confused milling about of a throng of mourners, of people who are grieving. And then Mark continues, and people were weeping and wailing. The two verbs here are very strong. Weeping is the translation of Greek klio, which doesn't just mean that tears were trickling down their face. Klio is weeping in the sense of wailing. And the verb is used with special frequency in Greek to describe the weeping of parents for dead children. My son spent a lot of time at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he met a Stanford professor named Ian Morris, whose first and I think still best book is called Death, Ritual, and Social Structure in Classical Antiquity. And Ian Morris calls attention to all the tombstones from the ancient world where this verb, klio, wailing, describes the expression of parents over children who have died too young. And then Mark also says that they were alalazo, they were crying out loudly over the one who had died. The verb alalazo denotes a shrill tone. We might translate it keening. Verse 39, and when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making a tumult and wailing? The child has not died, but on the contrary, it's the strong Greek adversative, Allah. But on the Germans would say doch, right? On the contrary, she is sleeping. Now, at this point, let me pause and ask, is ambiguity being introduced here into the story? In other words, is there some uncertainty about the child's death? No. I agree with my colleague at Yale University, Adela Collins, in her great Hermeneia commentary on the Gospel of Mark. Adela Collins says, quote, the narrative rhetoric of the story makes clear that the little girl is really dead. So then I think we're confronted with this. If she is really dead, Jesus's assertion that she is sleeping reveals his unwillingness to accept the proposition that death is the end for this little girl. Evidently, what Jesus believed was in life and more life. The next verse. And they, that is the people of Jairus' household, they began to laugh mockingly at him. The Greek verb is katangelo, katagelao, and it means to laugh at in a sense of ridiculing. They know that she is dead, and so they mock his unwillingness to accept it. The text continues, but he drove them all out and took the father of the child and the mother and those with him, that is Peter, James, and John, and went into the room where the child was. And he grasped the hand of the child and said to her, Talitha cum, which, and Mark has to translate the Aramaic expression for his Greek readers, which means, girl, I say to you, wake up. Now, the little Aramaic phrase, Talitha cum, the great Old Testament Semitic scholar who turned his attention to the Old Testament, to the New Testament rather, at the end of his life, the great German scholar Larry Julius Wellhausen. I'm sure you heard of him during your time in Heidelberg. Wellhausen argued that the original reading of the text, found in some Gospels, was Rabitha rather than Talitha. And the reason that he argued this is because Rabitha in Aramaic is the colloquial, dialectical word for girl. It is far more common than Talitha. In fact, Talitha is a proper name. It's one version of the name Tabitha, which we still have, some people have it today. So if Wellhausen is correct, what Jesus actually says is this: Rabitha, little girl, Talitha, that's her name, wake up, calling her by name. Chapter 5, verse 42, and immediately the little girl arose and began to walk. And then Mark adds, and she was 12 years old. And they were immediately amazed, in great amazement. Now, before I ask you to reflect with me on the importance of this story and what it tells us about the attitude of Jesus toward death, I want to just quickly compare this story with two other stories that are contemporary with the Gospel of Mark. There is a story told about the famous doctor Asclepiades. The story goes back to the time of Tiberius. And I'm going to read the story very quickly. And as I'm reading, I would ask you to listen for the difference between this story and the one about Jesus. Okay, here's the story. The famous Asclepiades, who ranks among the greatest of doctors, well, it happened once when he was returning to town from his country house. He observed an enormous funeral procession, a large multitude of people who had come out to perform the last honors, and they stood around the bier, all of them plunged in deep sorrow. Asclepiades went to the bier to see who had died. The poor fellow's limbs were already covered with spices. He was all ready for the pyre. But Asclepiades looked at him and perceived from certain signs that life was still in him. He handled his body and felt the warmth, though it could scarcely be detected. And the doctor cried out, "He lives! Throw down your torches. Take the funeral feast back to the man's home." And while he spoke, a murmur arose. Some said that they must believe the doctor's words, while others mocked him. In fact, some of the man's relatives offered opposition because they had already entered into possession of the dead man's property. Did you hear that, Jim and Joan? His will had already been made out. So they didn't want to believe the doctor. But Asclepiades persuaded them to delay the burial for a time. He carried the man home and revived him by means of certain drugs. Now, while you're thinking about that story and how it is both similar and different from the story about Jesus in Mark 5, let me read you another story. Again, contemporary with the Gospel of Mark. This one is a story told about the holy man, the Greek holy man, Apollonius of Tyana. Quote, "A girl seemed to have died just before the hour of her marriage. The bridegroom was following the bier, lamenting, along with a large crowd of mourners. Apollonius witnessed the grief and said, 'Put down the bier, for I will stop your tears that you are shedding for this maiden.' The crowd assumed that Apollonius was about to deliver a funeral oration, in other words, to speak words of consolation. But instead, he went to the body of the girl and touched her and listened for her breath, and the girl woke up from her seeming death. She spoke out loud, and they returned her to her father's house." Now, the biographer of Apollonius of Tyana, the philosopher Philostratus, he comments on this story. He says, "Now, whether Apollonius detected some spark of life in her, which those who were nursing her had not noticed, or whether life really was extinct and he restored it by the warmth of his touch, is a mysterious problem which neither I myself nor those present could decide." Now, if you've been thinking along with me about the similarities and differences between these stories, I think the difference is pretty clear, and it tells us something very poignant, very interesting about Jesus. The difference is that the doctor, Asclepiades, and the holy man, Apollonius, perceived that the person only seemed to be dead. They detected certain signs of life. But in the case of the story about Jesus, Jesus is confronted with the fact of the little girl's death. And here's the point. He cannot accept it. He cannot accept that death is the end for this little girl. He believed that God had created us for life and more life. Now that's the point that it brings home to me. I want to stop just at this point before we go any further and see if what we have said so far has raised any questions in your mind. This may be a new perspective on Jesus for you. I know it is for me to discover that Jesus not only believed that diseases were an intolerable constraint upon the full humanity intended by God in creation, evidently he had difficulty accepting death as the end for which God has created us. And as you can tell, I'm focusing attention here upon Jesus's attitude toward death, not upon the miracle itself. In other words, I'm not making an ontological or objective judgment, but rather I'm focusing on a psychological or spiritual aspect of Jesus of Nazareth, rooted in his belief about God. Okay, Pastor Charlie, I've said a lot so far. Some of it, I think, rather controversial. And I warn you, it's going to get more controversial. But let me stop at this point and see if there are comments, questions.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have a comment.
Well, Larry, wasn't there a work by Oscar Kuhlman contrasting the relationship of Socrates to death and Jesus to death? That Socrates' death was welcomed. He was pleased to receive it, that this body was of little worth and he was eager to be freed of it, whereas Jesus was, if this possible, let this death pass from me.
Larry, you are exactly right. And in so many ways, Oscar Kuhlman had profound insights. And so I find myself agreeing with the contrast. You know, according to Plato, just before Socrates died, after he had drunk the hemlock, he turned to his students around him, and his last words were, "Sacrifice a cock to Asclepius." Now, Asclepius is the healing god, and what Plato took from this was that Socrates viewed his life in this mortal body with all of our passions and limitations and weaknesses. He viewed life as a kind of sickness from which death would be a welcome release, setting his soul free. So you're quite right. Socrates and Jesus have very different attitudes toward death. That's a very accurate observation that Kuhlman made. And Larry, if the Germans didn't give you a PhD, you should go back and ask for one.
I don't know if I'm on yet.
Yes,
I noticed
John,
in your two stories, these guys went to find the person rather than someone coming to them, and maybe they were looking for an opportunity to make themselves look better. The other thing is Jesus must have been very familiar with death, living in the society he lived in, and being by the age 30 or so, he must have known of a number of people dying and have been aware of it and understood it.
You're absolutely right, John. the mortality rate was so high in the ancient world. Children died of diseases, women died in childbirth. The average life expectancy for a male in the time of Jesus was about 26. 26. So and in fact, Roman historians have concluded that the death rate always exceeded the birth rate in ancient cities like Rome and Ephesus and Alexandria. And the only way that these cities maintained their population was the so-called Brownian movement of people into the city from the countryside, because the mortality rate was so high. So you're absolutely right. We're not, in the case of Jesus, we're not dealing with a naive person who, has only had a few encounters with death, who has been quarantined from the fact of death, like so many of us are today. The only time I've experienced death face to face was the death of my own mother. Here I am now, 60 plus years old, and I've only experienced death face to face in one case. But in the case of Jesus, after he walks away from the carpenter's bench and begins proclaiming the kingdom of God, I think we see a very interesting pattern. He devotes himself to healing. He devotes himself to exorcism. And then on those occasions, and we are about to look at another one, the case of the friend of Jesus, Lazarus. In that case too, Jesus refuses to accept the fact of his death. Well, now, Pastor Charlie, if you will mute everyone again, we will take another, even more controversial step into the text. All of this raised a new question for me. And Larry Hofsis, it is a question, I think, close to the one that Oscar Kuhlman was asking back in the 1950s. My question is this: how did Jesus confront his own death? I mean to say, once the inevitability of his death had become apparent, after he learns of the beheading of John the Baptist, and he knows what is coming for him. The earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, tells us that from that moment on, Jesus began to teach his disciples, listen to this, Mark chapter 8, verse 31, and he began to teach them that it is necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and to be rejected by the elders and the chief priest and the legal experts and to be killed, ... Do you know what comes next? And after 3 days to rise. And the same message is repeated by Mark in chapter 9, verse 31, and in chapter 10, verse 34. Now, let me tell you, Pastor Charlie, when I was a student back at Yale Divinity School, I was taught by my enlightened professors that what we have here in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus says, after 3 days to rise, what we have in Latin is called a vaticinium ex eventu. Can my lawyers translate that for me? A prophecy or a prediction after the fact. In other words, Bill, I was taught that the early Christians retrojected their own Easter faith, their own experience of Jesus as living. They projected it back into the mouth of Jesus. And that is how it was customarily regarded by historical critics of the New Testament after the Enlightenment. But now, I hope this won't scare or disappoint anybody, I have to tell you, I'm having second thoughts. I'm having second thoughts. Did Jesus have difficulty accepting that death would be the end of the story for himself? I think there is a profound theological reflection on Jesus's response to death in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. If you want to look at it with me, chapter 11. You know the story. Jesus is informed that his dear friend, Lazarus, is sick. But notice that according to the Gospel of John, Jesus does not immediately go to Bethany, where Lazarus lives. He waits. And after 2 days, Jesus decides to go. Now, the disciples try to persuade Jesus not to go. Why? Because they know that the leaders of the Jews are seeking to kill Jesus. But Jesus decides to go anyway. Now, look at John chapter 11, verse 14. This verse makes clear that Jesus and the disciples learned, that is, they knew that Lazarus had died. And then when Jesus arrives finally in Bethany, both Martha and Mary, the sisters of Lazarus, they criticize Jesus for not coming sooner. You remember they say, Lord, if you had only been here, my brother would not have died. So there is no question about the fact that Lazarus is dead. So then watch what happens. Jesus commands that the stone be taken away from Lazarus' tomb. And Martha understandably hesitates. She explains to Jesus, Lord, he already stinks because he has been dead for 4 days. Now, you need to know that in the time of Jesus, there was a widespread belief among the Jews that the spirit of a person lingered near the body for 3 days. And that's why it's so important that Martha says, it is already the 4th day. It's too late. The spirit is gone and the body is decaying. And there is further evidence that everyone knows that Lazarus is dead. Look at chapter 11, verses 33 and 38, where Jesus sees the friends of Mary and Martha, the people that have come to console them, and he sees that they are weeping and wailing. But look how Jesus responds. According to John, the Greek verb is embriaomai. Can you say that with me? Embriaomai. And it means to boil up inside. When Jesus sees the people giving in to the notion that Lazarus is dead. He boils up inside. And when Mary and Martha explained to Jesus that Lazarus is dead and that it is too late for Jesus to do anything, look at chapter 11, verse 25, which is a very profound theological reflection, I think, by the author of John's Gospel. I don't know if the historical Jesus said this, but it is so profound. Jesus says to Mary and Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even when he dies, he will live. Well, let me bring this to a point. 2,000 years later, Pastor Charlie, at worship service this morning, a little while ago, I imagine the gathered church at the proper moment in the worship service joined in the credo. And you know, in our confession of faith, it says what? I believe in the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Now, I want to confess the truth to you all. I don't know what that means. I'm not sure anyone knows what that means. But what I want to focus on is the belief. A belief which I have now concluded comes all the way down to us from Jesus himself, from the one who believed that death is not the end for which God created us. We still believe in the resurrection and the life. And that makes all the difference in how you live, in how you respond to disease and to death. I think what started me on these novel and audacious thoughts was an observation made by one of the doctors on CNN when the interviewer asked the doctor about the future of the coronavirus, and the doctor said, well, he said, in medicine we have a saying, and the saying is, all bleeding eventually stops. Well, yes, it stops when a person bleeds to death. That's the fact. That's the hard, cold fact. I don't know whether we will survive the coronavirus. I may not survive if I return to teach in New York. The coronavirus may be with us for years to come. They may not find a vaccine. So whether we will live for another year or 2 or 5, eventually we will die, whether it is from this pandemic or from the cancer that is rooted so deeply in my family and perhaps in yours too. But that's not the point. The point is, how do we live in the face of death? How do we respond? And I think what we believe makes all the difference. It makes all the difference. I want to conclude by quoting a fragment of a poem by the great American novelist John Updike, but he actually wrote a few poems. And a few years ago, one of his poems was printed in the New York Times on Easter Sunday. And in that poem, I'm just going to quote a small section of it. John Updike says, "If when we die, we're dead." Right, that's the first proposition. if when we die we're dead, then the world is ours like gaudy grain, to be reaped while we're here without regret. But if not, that is to say, if when we die we're not dead, if not, then, Updike said, there is an ominous duty to feel with the mite. The mite is the smallest creature, the thing that crawls on me when I'm in the garden. To feel with the mite. And the dragon is ours, and a burden in being. Yeah, it makes a difference. What we believe about death and about life. So I've argued this morning that Jesus himself, it was a surprising discovery for me. I've argued that the historical Jesus had real difficulty accepting that death was the end of the story for those whom God created and loved. And I've even argued that Jesus had difficulty accepting his own death as the end. If we had time, I would explore with you a saying of Jesus found in Q, that most primitive collection of Jesus material. It's the Jonah logion. The Pharisees challenged Jesus to provide a sign. Give us a sign that you are who you claim to be. And Jesus answered, the only sign that will be given is the sign of Jonah. And in Matthew's version, Matthew explains that the meaning of the sign of Jonah is that just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the deep, down in the waters of death, so Jesus would be 3 days and 3 nights in the earth, but would then be raised to life. So I think there is actually quite a bit of evidence, not just a little bit, that the historical Jesus pushed back against the proposition that death is the end for which God had created us. Jesus of Nazareth believed that what God intended was life and more life. And when we say in the Credo, I believe in the resurrection of the dead, it is a 2,000-year-old echo, I think, of the faith of Jesus of Nazareth. Well, Pastor Charlie, do we have time? We have a little bit of time to open things up for some final thoughts, reflections.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
I hope I haven't shocked everybody too much by my revisionist understanding of Jesus. But Larry Hofsis, you gave me some credibility by referring to my predecessor, Oscar Kuhlman.
Larry Welborn, Dr. Welborn, you in a class before had said something about, we had talked about whether people who died before Jesus came would be saved, you know.
Yes. Yes.
Because they hadn't had a chance to believe in him. And you quoted some language from some text that said that something about he would go to the sleeping and bring them up, I think is what you said. You think that's what Jesus meant when he said that the girl was sleeping?
Thank you very much. There are two important points there, Joan, in what you've said. The language of sleep was found throughout the ancient Mediterranean as a euphemism or a metaphor for death. So the sleep of death, right? Death was spoken of as a last or final sleep. So that's one point that needs to be made. I mean, it was all over the Mediterranean, not just Jewish, but also Greek and Roman. The comparison of death with a final sleep. Now, Joan, what you are remembering is the Gospel of Peter, which was found in 1886, buried in the grave of a Coptic monk in Egypt. It's a short fragmentary gospel that claims to be the eyewitness testimony of Simon Peter. And at one moment in that gospel, as Jesus is coming forth from the tomb on Sunday morning, a voice speaks out of heaven, as it did when? At the baptism and at the transfiguration. In Hebrew, it's referred to as a bat kol, an echo of the divine voice, the daughter of a voice. A voice in the Gospel of Peter speaks out of heaven as Jesus is coming forth from the tomb, and the voice asks, "Did you preach," that is the good news, "to those who sleep?" See, Joan, there it is, to the dead, to the people who had died before the resurrection, to all those faithful and righteous people who came before us. Did you share the good news with them? And according to the Gospel of Peter, a voice answered, "Apotustauru," from the cross, and the voice answered, "Yes," in Greek, "nigh." So thank you, Joan, for remembering that. My goodness, you have a good memory. And it's a very interesting point to make in connection with what we have explored today. Thank you. Other observations, comments?
Charlie, you've been using on your daily blogs, I think twice you've used something from Tony Campolo.
Yes.
And maybe this would be a time for us to remember, I think a famous sermon perhaps that he had when he looked around, and as we would look around today at the coronavirus, it looks an awful lot like Good Friday.
Yes.
And he would oftentimes, I think in paragraph after, looks like Good Friday. And then he would always follow that, but Sunday's coming. And I think that maybe is what that would fit with what you have, Larry, that he has this belief that it looks like it's the end, but in reality, it's the beginning.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Thank you. You know, Pastor Charlie, it's been my experience in the past that good preachers have spoken up after my lesson in order to finish my message. And I think Larry Hofsas just did that for us. Other comments, questions?
Larry, I remember from another earlier class that you taught about your own study of tombstones before and after Jesus. And the difference was after Jesus in how hopeful were the figures on tombstones.
Oh, Jim, thank you so much for making that point. And do you remember, Jim, when we were looking at those tombstones, do you remember what, as it turns out, is the most frequently represented scene on ancient Christian sarcophagi? What is the image that is sculpted on those sarcophagi more frequently than any other? Does anyone remember? You can see an example of it if you go to the museum at Oberlin College. They've got a couple of, just up the road at Oberlin, they have some early Christian sarcophagi. Do you remember what it is? It's Jonah. It's Jonah. Jonah appears more frequently on early Christian sarcophagi than any other symbol. And the message is clear. Just as Jonah was what? 3 days and 3 nights in the deep waters of the sea, down in the chaos of death, and then was brought up by God out of the deep. So the early Christians inherited, I would argue, from the historical Jesus, the belief in the resurrection and the life, that death would not be the end for which God had created them. And they expressed that by putting the image of Jonah on their tombstones. Thank you so much, Jim, for bringing that very pertinent point back into our conversation.
If I may, don't want to overwork this, but I heard a German theologian speak of something I'd never heard before, and that is in Germany there are pulpits that are called Jonah pulpits.
Oh, interesting.
They evidently have the imagery of Jonah going into the belly of the whale. And is he ever going to come out? Will he ever see the light again? And the preacher is thereby instructed to feel the same way as Jonah when he goes in and brings all the cares of the world, like coronavirus and so on. Will we ever emerge? Will we ever see light again? Will we ever worship in person again? Takes all of that into the pulpit. And in there, he wrestles with the word. And at the end of the sermon, he comes out with the message that, yeah, this is the good news. This is not the end. This is the beginning. And like one of my profs said, experience the longest patooey in the world.
Oh, that's really wonderful.
It lands up on the shore.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, Pastor Charlie, I see that our time has run out. Charlie, I think you're muted.
Dr. Welborn, I want to thank you for this this class. I'm sure I echo many of the people gathered here today, all the people here, that we really appreciate you taking the time to do this and for being flexible and coming to the church to be here so that we can have a good connection. And I saw Bill Sayers' comment that he enjoys not having to get dressed up. He can go to the basement of his home and participate in a class. And so how great we're able to do this and have this ability to be connected, and not just for the class, but also to be connected with people in the congregation and friends, because we have been so isolated right now. And so I thank you for giving us that opportunity to be able to do that. And we will have you back, I'm sure.
Thank you. Yes. I'm so grateful for my friendship and for my colleagues at the wonderful Epiphany Church. It's my favorite church. And thank you all once again for taking this journey with me. And I look forward to the next opportunity, whether it is in person or whether once again it's by Zoom.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. God bless you all. And Dr. Welborn, God bless you. And thank you. We wish you God's blessings, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody.